Thank you for all for coming. I'm here to talk about God of War Combat. And this talk will go into some of the details surrounding the design changes to our combat system in the last God of War. I'm not going to get into a lot of technical details, but there are a lot of other combat-related talks that I'll reference later that go deeper into some of the concepts I'm going to mention here. So first, a quick introduction. My name is Jason. I've been at Sony Santa Monica for over 14 years, and I've worked on every God of War. I was the lead gameplay designer on the last God of War, and that meant I was involved with almost everything gameplay related, from bosses to enemies to Kratos and Atreus. So over a third of my life has been spent thinking about Kratos and what he can do. I literally have dreams about it at this point. It's really, really strange. But with me was a team of very talented combat designers, some of which are inside the studio right now, or inside this building. And also old school God of War veterans, Derek Daniels and Eric Williams, who were combat designers in the first two God of Wars back in 2005 and 2007. So the development of this game was definitely a team effort. So previously we made these games. And the changes in each game was mainly about variety. You know, we wanted to make each one bigger, grander, more weapons, more enemies, more bosses. We'd make some small refinements to the system each time, but nothing too major. So after 10 years or so, it was exciting to try to do something new. So what now? We were going back to the drawing board. This one would be about reinvention. We wanted a new combat system that felt new and fresh. This game was still called God of War, though, so we would try to retain what our team and our fans loved about the game. So we'll talk about the path in this talk of how we did this. First, the vision. What do we want to retain from the previous God of War games? And what were we going to reinvent? So we start with the vision. And our director, Corey, gave us multiple pages of vision in the form of a book. And this was given to the entire team and detailed the major pillars and direction of the game. All studio departments would read this book as an initial guiding point of figuring out what to do. So it had a lot of details of narrative, art, and levels, or whatever. Who cares about that? I cared about combat. I was lead gameplay designer. So I jumped right to that section. So what I found was the desire for a complete overhaul. The camera would be close, like a third-person camera, or third-person shooter. The game would have strafe controls like Last of Us in a melee-focused game. The Chaos Blades, the most iconic thing about Kratos, were going to be replaced with the basic axe. UI, like combo counters, were gone. We were taking out circle grabs and mini-games. And a little kid would follow you through this entire journey. So, yeah, the initial response to this was, well, how are we going to do any of that? I mean, this is the way the game looked like before. That's the way most action games look like, at least melee action games. And the blades, that was such an iconic weapon, like how could we lose those? But we did a few early tests, and this is what it looked like. So we put in the camera, we gave him an axe, we put in a bunch of shirtless dudes, and we used our existing tech to get things in the game. And the results confirmed every bias that we could have dreamed of. It was terrible. Like, it was really hard to see anything. Like, look at that, you're trying to hit this guy, floating guy for no reason. This was not inspiring any kind of confidence. So the next question on everyone's mind was why? Like, why were we doing any of this? It felt like we were moving God of War Combat from God of War. Everything we had been building up at this point would be thrown away, replaced with a game that could potentially feel nothing like it. So what did we do? We started zooming the camera out, and we played it again. So here's some footage of a zoomed-out camera view a little bit later in development. And Kratos could attack all around him like he used to be able to do. The enemies were starting to appear behind Kratos, so we were starting to get feedback of, well, let's remove the strafe controls. Why do we have those in the game? And of course they were asking that. With this viewpoint, no games control this way. And while we were getting some positive feedback on this camera, it still wasn't zoomed out far enough. Like, people wanted more. And I know what they wanted. They wanted that familiar scent. You know, as we started zooming the camera out, you started to see all your enemies making the same type of combat decisions you were making in all the God of Wars. So if we zoomed out again, it would bring us right back to where we were comfortable. And it was clear that's what a lot of people wanted us to do. And to be honest, I kind of wanted to do this too. I mean, we were just starting out here. We knew within a year we wanted to put a snippet of gameplay together. How are we going to get this done? So that's when I decided to zoom the camera back in. And honestly, this decision was going to haunt me for a long time. I mean, here I was embracing the very thing that seemed to be creating all our problems. But I felt we were simply running away from the changes as opposed to really breaking them down and figuring them out. I mean, I was kind of used to this in God of War, you know, in the years I've worked there. We had Pegasus in God of War 2, we had Giant Titans in God of War 3, we had multiplayer in God of War Ascension. It was like every single time there's something impossible that it feels like you cannot do. And that's what this seemed like. So this was our chance to tackle new problems, so let's tackle them. And that meant first accepting this vision goal. The game would feel close and personal. You are in there with Kratos now and not just watching him from afar. And as far as what we wanted the game to feel like, let's take another look at that vision book and maybe read it this time. And once you ignore the knee-jerk reactions to some of the details of the changes, there were actually a few excerpts that gave us some clues of what to do. Kratos was older, he was more deliberate in this game. And by playing on people's real-life expectations, we'll create a more intuitive and inviting gameplay loop. This quote was interesting because it was talking about trying to add some intuitive gameplay mechanisms to games like this or melee action games that usually are kind of abstract. It's hard to understand how to play those things. So this made a sense as a path to changing the game. Old God of War was partially about flinging your blades of chaos in every direction, hitting enemies everywhere. You could make some deliberate choices, but they weren't the focus. Your goal was to hit as many enemies as you could at once and use your crowd-clearing abilities as much as possible. So let's make controlling Kratos more precise and deliberate. Let's not focus on only the issues with the camera and strafe and all that. Let's focus on design ideas on how to make this game more deliberate and solve the camera along the way. So when we think about that word deliberate, first, awareness is the first thing you have to think about, because with this close camera, just being aware of the enemy takes effort, being aware of the arena itself takes effort. We would need to tune enemies accordingly to allow player time to take in their surroundings. So this meant slower paced combat. The blades in combat in the past were very, very fast, and this time we would investigate slowing things down a bit. And this would seem to work well with giving the player more time to make deliberate decisions. And lastly, your choice of target was much more important now. The blades used to hit many targets at once. Your axe would be focused on one at a time. So to tackle those camera changes, we aimed to make a close camera that was a balance between visibility and intuitive control. It needed to be just close enough that strafe always made sense, but just far enough that you could see immediate threats to your sides, prompting the desire to move and reposition. So I drew some icons to kind of help us out here. So this was the old God of War with the camera zoomed out, Kratos in the middle, and everything in view. And if the enemy were to appear outside of view, we would actually usually disable that enemy. He wouldn't be allowed to attack because we were trying to put everything on screen at once. This is partially why in Ascension, Kratos started to become like a speck on screen as we try to get grander with more and more enemies on the screen. Now we were trying to put the camera really close to Kratos, but our first tests had the camera this close. So if an enemy was actually right out there hitting you, and you wouldn't even see this enemy. So we would want to zoom the camera out just a bit so you can see him, but not enough that you could think you could turn around and hit him. And if that enemy started to go off screen, well, then we'd expect the obvious, like you should just turn around and take a look at him. So we implemented these changes, and then we got this. And the result was positive. People were now controlling Kratos a little bit more intuitively. They were at least looking around, kind of similar to a third-person shooter, and trying to find their enemies, and it was kind of fun to actually whip around, turn around, and keep track of what's going on. And also didn't play much worse than our previous zoomed-out tests because there was actually a lot of other problems to figure out. So we started paying more attention to the axe itself. Because when you think about the blades of old, they had a strong power and mythical fantasy. They had chains and they were on fire. And the axe that was currently in his hand, though, it felt like you could just go to Home Depot and buy that thing. Like it was simple, it wasn't interesting, no mythical touches like the awesome blades that made them feel powerful. So selling this power was a big part of Kratos' fantasy, as a character fantasy. For this weapon to have a chance to live up to the mythos of the blades, it had to be powerful. So let's start trying to add some interesting components to the axe. To emphasize the feeling of power and deliberate decision-making, we decided to start simple and make the axe combos short. The blades had an 8-hit combo that took some time to get to a powerful finisher. A shorter combo would get there faster. And that might make it feel a bit more punchy, powerful. It would also work better with a tight camera, since it would be a shorter period of time locked into an extended combo sequence, vulnerable to attacks from the sides. Next, to give the axe a fantasy of its own, we tried out a simple concept. What if the axe stuck into enemies? These axe sticks were a concept that Corey and others liked very early, as it gave the axe a distinct feel from previous weapons in other games. So in the new God of War, we would actually connect and pause the axe inside the enemy and play an animation of Kratos ripping it out. And this was one of our early implementations. Everything was full synced animations between Kratos and enemy. And this looked and felt powerful. And it also was slowing the pace of combat, kind of like what we wanted to do, making things feel more deliberate. So this was a good starting point in making the axe feel unique and different within the game. You would kind of get in there with this kind of combat system and assassinate quickly with short combos. Then you'd whip the camera around and find your next target. Everything we had been talking about thus far. But this wasn't enough to make the axe feel special, compared to the blades anyway. There also wasn't anything really more intuitive added by this. So while all this was going on, animators were hard at work creating animation previs for various ideas for the axe. These are just animations that they would use to kind of prove out or potentially show us what combat could look like. So one day, our lead animator, Mehdi, animated this idea by himself. So you see it has everything that we've been talking about, close camera, really short cameras, or combos really short. But then right here, he throws the axe away to protect Atreus and slams his head in the wall. So I remember when I first saw this that, like, first of all, the axe throw looked awesome, but how would we ever do this? Like, Kratos throwing his iconic weapon away that we're trying to make feel special, what if he didn't pick it up? What if he just left it there? So we kind of dismissed this idea for a while, until one man named Vincent Napoli, our lead systems designer, made the critical suggestion to call back the axe in command with a certain Norse god. Prototypes were made, partially with our amazing programmer, George Mall, who's sitting right there and not making me say this at all. And it immediately resonated with the team. The concept was deliberate. It encouraged the player to look around and attack everything with precision. With the axe gone, he could target someone else with his bare hands. The concept also worked with our new camera. I mean, who would have known that a third-person shooter camera could use some third-person shooting? So the aiming with the reticle from this vantage point was actually very intuitive, and it was hitting that goal as well. And lastly, it was mythical, and this one was a big deal, because at first the initial direction of this entire game was very, very grounded. So the axe was very simple. But this gave the axe something special, similar to how the blades had its chains, and it opened the door to more mythical additions to the axe later on. So at the end of that first year of development, it was time to put together a playable snippet of the game, and we called that first playable. The goal was to implement all the ideas with higher fidelity and art necessary to showcase the vision. So that included the close camera, showing the new perspective of the world, shorter combos and slower pace, the axe sticks showcasing power, our brand new axe throw, and a functioning Atreus. And I know we haven't been talking about him much just thus far, but he was a very difficult part of this game. Like, the entire time, Corey was reminding everybody constantly that we can't cut this guy, even though everybody wanted to, because it was so difficult. So at this point in first playable, we kind of just wanted to get him in working, and he wasn't an integral part of the combat system just yet. We were also trying to hit all the key words we've been talking about: close and personal combat, deliberate, and mythical, and powerful. So here's a snippet of that first playable. And everything's looking good. The art team was knocking it out of the park, and before any fights began, it felt like you could appreciate exploring this world from this viewpoint. And the axe throw was in there and working. You could recall it any time. And then we had these very long axe sticks when Kratos would actually land attacks. That felt powerful. And the combos were shorter, so you just get rid of this guy real quick. And we also showcased just some basic strategies of what could happen, where if you threw your axe to one guy, you kick another guy off the edge. So mission accomplished. You know, we did everything in 1 year. Like, just everybody in game development knows you get the hole in one, it just works perfectly. It didn't, because it didn't play well. So here's some footage of somebody actually trying to play that content. And what you'll see is a lot of Kratos evasion and a lot of backing up. And you'll see why in just a little bit. So he's trying his best to hit these enemies, but not getting much luck. He swings here, up, hit out of it. Let's back up again. Throws his axe one more time, because it's the safest thing he could probably do. Jump at this guy, nothing happened. Okay, well, let me try to mash into him a little bit. Up, hit out of it again, let's back up. And this was like the whole game right here, like everybody just backing up and running away from everything. And I think that this last part of that video really is telling, because if you look at what happens after Kratos swings twice, he blocks, and he didn't have his shield at this point, so he was blocking just like this. But if you look at the enemies on the screen, nobody's doing anything. Like, he's just blocking because he's afraid that they might do something, because he doesn't have any time to respond to what's happening on the screen. And this is very not God of War at all. Like, all this backing up, all this fear. And at the end of this demo, we showed the player this, because this is supposed to hype you up on some big class fight that you could get at the end of this. But after actually playing it, the only real player response was that. So what was missing? We had a cool looking game there, but it wasn't God of War yet. And we weren't retaining that feel. So now we're going to talk about how we aim to do just that, and the design decisions we made to ensure this game continues to feel like God of War. So first we look at that word deliberate, because maybe that was the problem all along. After all, it seems like all these decisions that were making the game deliberate was setting us on a road that we didn't like. But I believe the problem was more that the word deliberate doesn't mean careful. God of War was not about being careful. You can make meaningful decisions without having to worry about everything. So what do we do now? So we think about what God of War actually was, and we deconstruct the best of the previous combat system and ensure it's brought back into the new system. We wanted players to feel similar to how they felt in previous God of War games in this new perspective. The tricky thing was trying to get this to work without sacrificing the vision goals, so we had to continue to remember those. So when we think about the God of War feel, we break it down into a few key components: one versus many, playful combat, and power for all. And I'm going to break down each one of those categories shortly. So for one versus many, God of War was always about this. Kratos had this built into his chains, so everyone could see Kratos take on hordes of enemies and feel confident that he'd make it through alive. We knew that we had to make crowd control accessible if players were going to retain this confidence. And the blades were great at this, even while mashing square, while axe was currently terrible. So while we were thinking about what the blades used to be, Corey told me of a thematic phrase that was used to describe the blades a long time ago in the original God of War. And I like phrases like this because it can help ground future decisions that fail to match the theme. So that phrase was ballet of fire. And I laughed when he told me this, but when you think about it, the term really describes the feel and look of those blade attacks: the footwork, the elegance, a powerful mythical fire shredding everything in sight, twirling around, hitting all the enemies in every direction. But we couldn't take that approach with the axe because of the camera angle. We also wanted to give the axe a different feel. So we wanted to create a thematic tagline that would encapsulate this feel, and this is what we came up with: plow the road. And because we really wanted it to feel this way, we wanted to feel like you could just dive through hordes of enemies and not have to worry about anything. And we accomplished this partially by causing the enemies you attack to hit other enemies behind that enemy. So when Kratos attacks an enemy, that enemy plays a reaction, and he bumps into enemies behind him, bringing everybody backward. And what ends up happening is that Kratos has this protective zone in front of him the entire time he's mashing that button. So simply mashing R1 feels a little bit safer and more powerful into simple groups of enemies. Before we added this, the enemies behind the attacked enemy would either slide around and attack the player or disrupt the flow or slide off camera. This would encourage players to poke attacks and never complete combos like we saw in the first playable. So we wanted him to just shred through enemies. The player should not be afraid to track into the group, because that's what Kratos was all about. The axe would do it through sheer power as he plows the road ahead. It also made crowd control a little bit more deliberate. You couldn't twirl around and hit everyone everywhere, but you could face a direction and drag a crowd of enemies forward. This was also a step in alleviating some of the issues with the close camera, since Kratos could charge into a crowd and keep them in front of him with each attack. And you probably noticed while looking at that we sped up those axe attacks, or axe sticks, because those axe sticks were like the bane of my existence for a very, very long time. It's like they were slowing everything down, making it very hard to fight. Everybody liked the power and the feel of those things, so we tried to actually do a dynamic solution where the axe would embed temporarily, but it wouldn't stop Kratos from actually moving or rotating or doing anything. It made the game feel a lot better. And instead of slowing Kratos down with those slow axe sticks that we had, let's just slow the enemies down using something else: frost. And similar to the blades and fire, the axe having frost and ice was mythical. It would add intuitive effects. Enemies struck by cold would be slowed or frozen, and you could easily understand how that might help you in crowd control, slowing the enemies down. And finally, it gave context to a lot of special area of effect attacks that Kratos could do to attack multiple enemies at once to help that one versus many concept. So all this was nice additions to help that one versus many, but it was also helped our next part of God of War feel, which is playful combat. And what I mean by play here is that it should be fun moving Kratos around, linking various moves together, or having fun knocking around the enemy cast. All of this should be enjoyable before even worrying about the enemy designs or specific obstacles you will face. So let's start with why this is important with the player's moveset. There's a lot of chaos in any game with lots of enemies on screen, which we knew we wanted. And players needed to be able to react quickly to what they see. If they start an action, they should be able to change their mind instantly. And to help explain the importance of this, I like to reference an Apple design talk called Designing Fluid Interfaces. This talk discussed some of the philosophies on making their iPhone UI feel fluid and good to the user, and there's some great parallels to gameplay design. They use this example that if somebody started walking across the room and wanted to change their mind and turn the other way, they don't have to wait until they get to the end of the room to make that decision, because this is reality. This is what people do all the time. They start an action and they stop it whenever they want. So when users are not capable of doing that in the user interface, it just feels bad, not connected with their expectations. So they designed everything in the iPhone UI to be interruptible. They described it as making the UI feel like an extension of yourself. And that's how we've always felt about Kratos. And God of War games are old. If you think it, usually you can do it. We allow canceling moves into other moves. We prioritize defensive canceling, since those are the typical actions people want to do spontaneously. In a car, you might be able to live with slow acceleration in most scenarios, but you would like to stop instantly to avoid accidents. But in special scenarios, we do allow some offense to cancel other offense if it's special enough. So here's a small example with our launch move. So if you press R2, you do this launch, and that's the move in its entirety. But you can also cancel that at the end of the recovery frame into block. Or you can cancel it right after the hit frame into block, or right before the hit frame, or just right away. And we allow this canceling because simply pressing the attack button shouldn't be a risky commitment in a God of War game. We want to encourage players to play with their moveset. So let's look at how we applied this logic to our new concept, the axe throw. The axe throw has two primary commands, L2 to pull aim, and triangle to recall the axe. We wanted to ensure that these actions had a God of War style canceling to ensure that they felt right. So we allow you to cancel the L2 throw, or the pull aim, in scenarios where you're most likely to do it, just after an action or after an attack. This allows players to follow up most actions with a quick axe throw. We could have let you cancel the entire attack with that, but then you might have a hard time doing combos, hitting an enemy and then following up with this. The recall, though, was special. We allow that to cancel any time. So if you look at this, right in the middle of my kick, I can just cancel that. It looks a little weird, but we're okay with that because the feel of recalling when you want is more important. You can even cancel that recall with an evade, as shown here, because we prioritize defense. And when you combine everything together, it could look like this. This is kind of crazy, chaotic, just canceling everything all the time. You could look at this and wonder why you would even want to allow this in the game. But it also enables things like this, controlled deliberate canceling. If you sidestep cancel mid-combo, we allow that combo to continue if you keep pressing attack, rewarding that decision. And that allows precision and evasion while progressing your combo. So we don't mind the chaotic results because most players won't make the game look that bad. But they will feel the difference if they weren't allowed to play with their moveset in this way, which is why we wish to retain that from the God of War of old. Next, the other part of playful combat is playing with your enemies. And we used to do this with the two core attack buttons in every God of War. So let's deconstruct their purpose. Before they were square and triangle, but now they were R1 and R2 because of the third-person camera. Most people would probably reference those as light and heavy attacks. And the light attacks were pretty straightforward. They gave us way to the most basic of offense to allow the player to do simple combinations of attacks. But why would the player ever press that heavy button? What's the player's choice when they're pressing that button? Damage sounds like a good start. It's called heavy attack, after all. But in playtests, it sometimes tends to be ambiguous. We didn't have any damage numbers on the screen. We didn't have any way to show that it was doing that much damage. So how much damage would it need to do to be worthy of use? If it does too much, then it competes with ever pressing the light button. And if you penalize me for pressing it, well, that doesn't seem as fun. You could give it a distinct ability, such as breaking blocks. That gives it a good reason to exist. But only if you're actually fighting a character that blocks. So we wanted people thinking about pressing this button most of the time, not only in specific scenarios. What about heavy reactions? We had that in first playable. Bigger reactions feel good in general. But if there's no difference strategically, that nuance wears off over time. And that's where we were at in our first playable demo. The answer for God of War is that we actually don't only call it this heavy button, we call it the setup button, because its purpose is to set up the enemies for further attack. We do this with a large enemy state change that gives more options to the player after hitting that character. Launching, for example, leads to an enemy air state that encourages players to follow up and attack them in midair. And launching is inherently playful, because you want to see how long you can keep them in the air, like playing paddleball. And the significance of this is that enemies are designed to be punching bags that aren't meant to die right away. I used to run around and say this in the studio all the time, where it's like, the punching bag, it feels terrible, and people would look at me like I was nuts. And I didn't have this sweet GDC presentation to make it clear. You know, Because what I meant by that is that in God of War, players are supposed to play with their enemies. They're not supposed to die that fast. We want enemies changing state constantly as you knock them around. So let's go through some of the various hit reactions in the new God of War to get more details on how we did this. And I'm going to split them up into two camps. Normal reactions, which differ mostly in translation and recovery time, and setup reactions that are designed to encourage some kind of player follow-up. And we actually had more reactions than just this, but this suite was the core of what existed in the system, and the game became more fun once we added these back. So starting with the simplest, we have basic. And all this is just a reaction that's short enough or long enough that you can continue your combo. But if you look at that Draugr and how long he kind of sits there, especially after this one attack right here, that was actually good because it gave us plenty of time to look around and not have to worry about the enemy even after one hit. Stagger is a more intense version of this reaction, which results from stronger attacks from the player, like a sprint attack. Longer recovery means even more time to make decisions. And for our first setup reaction, we have launch. And launch just feels good and powerful for all the reasons that we said. It took us a long time to put this back in the game because we were trying to make the game feel grounded. But this reaction is just too fun. It's fun to juggle, it's fun to follow up, and it's immediately clear the difference between R2 and R1. Spin was a reaction we had in the past, but it had greater purpose in this new God of War, because from this new camera angle, positioning an enemy's backside is intuitive and desirable. This reaction allowed the player to expose an enemy's back without any positioning and lay into the enemy's back at will, making you feel powerful. Trip was a quick way to get the enemy on the floor. Tripped enemies would remain on the floor longer, giving you even more time to make decisions. And flyback was a knockback reaction. Usually flyback would happen at the end of a combo because we kind of want to eject the enemy from Kratos after completing that combo. That kind of forces a choice on the player. Either I follow up and I chase him down, or I fight somebody else. It's a nice little pacing break within our combos. And the enemy that gets knocked back hits other enemies as well, which all slam into walls, they all get ringed out. It's very God of War. And with his new camera angle, we had an opportunity to emphasize our wall reactions. So any basic hit would cause most enemies to slump against it for a long recovery time before they can move again. And that's a really long recovery time. So it helps with that one versus many thing where I can knock a bunch of guys into walls and turn around and not worry about them for a while. And we also had a wall bounce if enemy was knocked against the wall with force, like that. So similar to Kratos' movesets, reactions themselves are designed to be canceled into each other. This encourages constant offense on the player, since most enemies will always respond a very God of War trait. And tougher enemies will typically have limited reactions and be less playful. So an example of a reaction like that is Twitch. And this basically is a reaction that the enemy recovers from so fast that they're allowed to attack again. This makes the player feel a little bit weaker, so we got to use this reaction carefully. We had one playtest where we went overboard on these reactions because later enemies had almost all their reactions being demoted into Twitch to make them feel harder. And every day I would see this one player kind of get his soul crushed more and more as he was trying to play the game, and the game was getting harder and harder, and nothing was working. And his soul was just like dying right in front of me. And on his last survey, which is a basic question about the game, he responded with this. Because exactly what you want to hear in a playtest, yeah. So this did give us some good information on what difficulty feels good. And we learned from this when we tuned our harder difficulties, because anybody who's played our harder difficulties probably knows we actually do use Twitch for a lot of the base R1 attacks. We want to encourage people to kind of move around and use their deliberate abilities like setups. But what we learned is that we don't demote the setup reaction, so launches still work, tripping still works, all that stuff still works. You just have to think a little bit more when you do it. So let's look again at the axe throw concept and see how that contributed to playing with your enemies in God of War. So to throw your axe, you'd hold L2, and from that you can press R1 for a light throw. Light throws just cause normal reactions most of the time, nothing too exciting there. But precision hits will cause those setup reactions. So you could hit him in the head and spin him around, giving instant access to his back, or you could hit him in his legs and trip him, giving that extra recovery time to make decisions. So just with that move alone, you have two options that you can make a follow-up decision up right afterwards. Or I could have pressed R2 and do my heavy attack. That's slower to throw, but with no precision advantages. But like a true setup button, landing this attack will change the enemy's state into frozen. So when he's in a frozen state, he's just sitting there, a sitting duck. You can just go and wail on him. Or you could kick this frozen enemy, and you can kick the enemy into other enemies, slowing them or knocking them into walls and make them shatter. And it helped us a lot because this was like a technique that a lot of people wouldn't know at first, so they'd feel good when they learned about it. and would give you a lot more time to handle your enemies because you could apply frost to everyone right from the start of the game. So through this mix of R1 and R2 play, you can have a lot of fun just playing with enemy reactions with the axe throw alone. Making the axe throw participate in playful combat is what formally cemented it in the God of War playstyle. And all this playful combat leads to improvisation. And all games have improvisation to some level, but for God of War, it was important to make sure that it was a combination of playing with your moveset and playing with your enemies. If you allow the player to do that, the players can create non-can combos and they can improvise. So if you have all that, you can get the game to look like this. A very deliberate, long combo that brings them all the way across the level, kicking them into this wall. And all these enemies are tuned right now to not even attack or do anything, because this was like a barometer check that we always use to test the fun factor of the game. Is it fun just to go in this test level and knock guys around? I'd be in meetings doing this while talking to people. If I'm not enjoying myself, there was probably a problem. Because if you couldn't do this, then it probably meant that our tools just weren't playful enough, or at least not as playful as the old God of War games. So the last thing we wanted to make sure we retained was that feeling of power. Because obviously we dedicate a lot of time making sure the player feels powerful, but what you really want is everyone to feel powerful, not just the gaming elite. So in the past God of War games, we always had some kind of God mode meter, and that meter gets full and the player gets access to some powerful attacks. Often this meter is fillable by a resource or combos or combat skill, but it's also driven by lack of skill, because it filled up when the player got attacked. So even if you're getting your ass kicked, you're often given the means to come back and win. And this allowed everyone to feel powerful, no matter how well they were doing at the game. So like the axe and the blades, it needed a thematic phrase. And we came up with this: monster out of the box. And once again, we had a theme that we could look back on to ensure our future decisions were in the right direction. And the theme here was that Kratos was letting that monster out that we all knew that he had from the previous God of War games, because this was a sequel, it was a continuation. And this is the moment where he'd feel the most like he used to be. And this rage meter, like previous God of War titles, would fill up as the player made mistakes and took damage, and also fill up a bit during attacks. So this made it more likely to be available when players needed it, and ensured you get to see Kratos at his most powerful, that all players could do that. And Kratos uses bare hands in this mode, and at first we followed down the same kind of deliberate path as everything else. But we realized quickly that players didn't want to feel deliberate while playing this. They just wanted that old school feeling of God of War. They just wanted to feel powerful, and making it less deliberate actually succeeded at that. Another important thing about Rage Mode is that it provided a get-out-of-jail-free card when the player is in trouble. Out of all our canceling rules, Rage Mode is the most flexible and can be used out of most reactions in negative states for Kratos. We wanted this to be reliable, so when the player is in the worst states, they can feel that turn the tide when they activate Rage Mode. So here's a player using Rage Mode. And he's going to usually actually just use one button, but you can see the effect it has on the enemies, much greater than anything else that you could do normally. So when players would break out this mode, they would get that sense of like, ah, yeah, this is awesome. And they'd have to go back and kind of be more deliberate feeling, but then they would go back to that when they needed it. It was a nice pacing flow for the combat of the game. So we had deconstructed that God of War feeling that we wanted to bring out of players by bringing some key things back. Simple, effective crowd control for one versus many fighting, a playful combat system that encourages improvising with Kratos' moveset, and an enemy reaction set that's built around knocking enemies around like a punching bag, and a simple, no-brainer method of fulfilling the power fantasy for everyone. But we still had a few elements to think about. And that's when we talk about reinventing the gameplay loop. Because even when we added all of these things, the kind of meta of the game, or what you were thinking about moment to moment, was actually very similar. So there are a few additions we needed to make to fully reinvent the game. So we already had a head start here. I mean, just changing the camera view was causing us to rethink how players handle Kratos and assess threats. But if you think combat-wise, again, the moment-to-moment was pretty similar. So there's other things we wanted to investigate. So while we're thinking about all the ways we can make the combat system more deliberate, naturally we thought about a stamina system. This is a regenerating meter that you need to attack and defend, and if you run out of it, you get tired and you can't do anything for a while. At first, it seemed to hit all our goals. It was deliberate, measured. It would certainly make you think about the attacks that you do. But we scrapped that one really early, and because we felt immediately that it wouldn't feel like God of War. And since we deconstructed God of War, we know what that means. We want Kratos to be overly offensive. We want your options to be available as often as possible. Defense should always be available. We didn't want players to have to stop and think too much before reacting to what was on screen. So in short, it just reduced our playful combat, so we scrapped it. That's not to say stamina is bad. A lot of games use stamina in great ways. It just didn't match that God of War feel that we were looking for. Now, there's another trope, though, that a lot of games have that would fit well with our direction, and this is why. As we started playtesting the game, we started to notice this behavior. So Kratos was, kind of going past enemies, knocking them around. Then you would turn around and get a look at everybody and kind of have no idea who you last hit, no idea how much damage you might apply to anyone. If only there was some way to reveal that information. And of course there was. Lifebars. This was dead simple. It added target prioritization in a way that we never had. Kill the enemy with the lowest health. We had talked about Lifebars before, but it was always rejected because we didn't want players really thinking about this. We liked them just going in there and having the playful combat and knocking enemies around. We didn't want them to overthink about what damage they were applying. But this addition favored our deliberate camera control for the reasons I gave. You could stop looking at an enemy, look at somewhere else, and then turn back and understand exactly where you left off. And it favored the direct attack style of the axe because it allowed you to pinpoint enemy and kind of drill them down with health if that's what you wanted to do. These were added late in the project in the last year of development, but it was something that fit like a glove with the new vision, and it opened the window to the next concept we wanted to reinvent, which is grabbing enemies. Because grabbing enemies was a huge part of God of War. I remember when I first arrived in the studio, that was the thing that made the difference for me first off, is that Kratos was actually grabbing guys. I didn't do that in other games I was playing. So from the get-go, we knew we wanted to have these signature kills again. The question was how. Previous games, you would damage an enemy until they were low health, and then a circle would pop over the head and you would grab them. We had been doing that low health thing for so long, felt like we needed to change that. So we wanted to retain the feeling of dominating your enemy like that, but reinvent the gameplay loop for doing it. So with that initial line in the sand, and especially the original line in the sand with no circles over enemies' heads, we had this idea pretty early in the project. Use meter to grab enemies. So instead of that rage mode I was talking about, what if we just filled up a meter, and every time that was full, you could grab an enemy? This was actually featured in our 2016 E3 demo. When everybody thought he was going to pull out his blades with Spartan Rage, he instead used his rage mode to go grab this troll. At first, it seemed to hit all the new vision goals. Reduction of UI over enemies' heads, deliberate usage of grab whenever you wanted as long as you had meter, and a heavy dose of improvisation, because part of the reasons why this was an interesting idea was that players could now start the fight with a grab if they wanted to. They didn't have to attack anyone. They didn't have to weaken anybody. But this failed miserably because of the same problem that we've had in every God of War with this meter. Everyone saves it, or they forget about it until they're in trouble. This meant long fights where enemies or players wouldn't grab anyone. They kill 20 enemies, maybe grab one, if that. So that sense of Kratos dominating his enemies repeatedly throughout fights just wasn't happening, and it felt like a big part of the game was missing. Now note, the rage mode that I was talking about before does have this feeling where it's like you could save it and all that, but it was this burst of power that you actually didn't want to happen all the time, so that was great. But for this was like a core to Kratos' character. We wanted this to happen all the time. So what about a stun system? Stun system had been brought up before. God of War Ascension actually had a stun system, if people actually remember that. An enemy stun meter would gradually fill when enemies attacked, and it would start to decrease when you stop attacking. So the player is encouraged to continue attacking as much as possible. When the meter is full, the enemy would get stunned, and then the enemy could be grabbed. But the meter in Ascension was invisible. You couldn't see it. And it made it difficult to balance and hard for players to understand. But remember those life bars that we added late in the project. So as we were implementing those life bars, we also rechanged the entire grab system within a few days right before a playtest. Production loved us. They couldn't get enough. But we believed in this because we thought that this would actually be the thing that now would give you a deliberate way to choose to grab enemies. So when we put it in, the results were huge. Immediately, players were grabbing enemies in fights, and Kratos was starting to look like Kratos again. The gameplay loop was familiar. Attack enemy, grab enemy. But the difference was now that the player could deliberately choose strategies to stun enemies versus damage them. And we could now reward all those deliberate actions we've been talking about for so long, like hitting enemies in the back, slamming them into walls, bare hand attacks versus the axe. All of those would do more stun. So all those deliberate actions we were thinking about now had a direct global purpose that resonated with Kratos' core fantasy. And once that dam broke, allowing all that design information, we began adding even more to it. First, the stun bar, as mentioned. Then the R3 button, because we couldn't put circles over guys' heads, but R3s under life bars. That was a go. And then fire and ice element damage as well, and even more. And just like that, we went from single damage system to a multi-damage, giving players even more reason to change attacks depending on what type of damage they wanted to apply to the enemy. So the stun system and damage types emphasize another old God of War concept, which was the happy accident. And happy accidents is a non-deliberate action that alters players' actions. An example is the parry system in most God of Wars. Parry and block are both on the same button, L1. If you press L1, you'll block, but if you time it correctly, you'll parry. So what ends up happening is that sometimes you'll just try to block, but parry by accident because you just happen to time it right. And that was a happy accident, one that a player could take advantage of and turn the tide of combat. It also reminds people that the parry exists if they forgot, making it more accessible. So these happy accidents lead to deliberate actions, like finding a $20 bill on the ground and picking it up, not turning it into your local police station, and instead going to the store and buying something. So while performing basic combat, you would see the enemy's stun meters change regardless of what people were trying to do. They'd be hitting them in the back, knocking them into walls unintentionally, but in doing that, actually adding stun to all the enemies. So nearly stunned enemies would prompt players to actually start strategizing towards stun if they weren't thinking about it before. And if they just accidentally stunned an enemy, well, that's even better. Just grab them. That's great. So this worked for fire and ice and all the other status effects as well, and it really added a different feel to the game. So we have this new emphasis on target prioritization with the Lifebars and multiple damage types, stun being the most important because that's the one that allows you to grab enemies. But there's still something I haven't talked about in a while, and that's this little guy. And as mentioned earlier, Atreus was initially not an exciting endeavor on the combat side. This tiny kid was tagging along Kratos all the time, made it seem like he would be a nuisance that would disrupt all this stuff that we're talking about. But there were some interesting ideas there right from the start. Early on, the idea of a stun button would separate him from the typical AI companion that you might find in other games. You would press this button, and you could actually take control of him briefly. And everybody envisioned this in their head where Kratos would launch a guy, and you'd press this button, and Atreus' arrows would juggle him. Very God of War, very immediate. That's what we wanted to do. But power, I mean, we've been talking about that a lot for Kratos, but it didn't feel like that was part of Atreus' journey. His fantasy wasn't about power. So when thinking about Atreus, I liked thinking about an old quote from Michael Jordan. And his quote was, "Talent wins games, but teamwork and intelligence wins championships." And that quote fit this vision. Kratos has all the talent in the world, but to complete this new journey, he would need Atreus. And so a good thematic tagline for Atreus was simply being a great teammate. And this made sense. All our inspirational art has been showing this the whole time. Kratos and Atreus were a team. So all design decisions should be centered around selling Atreus as a great teammate. So if you think about sports or your development teams, what would you consider a good teammate? Probably somebody that doesn't get in the way. A team is better with this teammate on it. Probably somebody that helps the team succeed. The teammate has value. You probably want this teammate to take direction, get results. And you probably don't want the teammate to wait to be asked. You want them to take some initiative and do some things on their own. And almost more importantly, he was a God of War teammate. So he should take part in all the stuff that we talked about before. That deliberate vision, the one versus many concepts and playfulness, and reinventing the grab with the stun system. So the stun button was Atreus taking direction. Each shot applied more stun to enemies than damage. This made Atreus a core part of Kratos' grab system right from the get-go, giving him instant value in most encounters. It also separated him from the power fantasy of Kratos because Atreus wasn't the one doing the grabbing, Kratos was. His shots also distracted enemies, so this took pressure off the player, creating a subtle bit of crowd control in his own way. It also presented their backs to Kratos, which is a good setup because the players could take advantage of that. And lastly, that playful combat we were talking about, which worked exactly as we thought. Like launching a guy and shooting a guy in the air kind of doesn't get old. It's just that kind of old school God of War feel that we wanted. But some people forgot to even press this button, to be honest. We'd give him all these sweet abilities only for players to forget he even exists. We'd have a playtest and we're like, hey, what'd you think about him? And he's like, I don't know, I forgot he was even there. But that's until he started taking more initiative. And Atreus didn't wait for Kratos to actually give a command to do anything. He could decide to attack, even combo, juggle enemies on his own. These autonomous attacks also added stun, meaning he could stun enemies on his own. Even if the player didn't notice all this directly each time it happened, all of this was helping with crowd control. And these autonomous attacks also contributed to the happy accidents that we've been talking about. You could strategically change your plan based on what you might see Atreus do in the distance, which is what you want out of a good teammate. So here's an example of Atreus taking part in all these systems. Try to keep an eye on Atreus throughout. He's going to come in on the right side. So there he is. He's going to jump on this guy, enhance this reaction for me. That's cool. Then he's just going to stun him so I can grab him, beat him down. That's cool. He's going to boot this guy in front of me. That's convenient. I'll just chop him up. He's going to follow up on that guy, knocking him down. That's great. Trip this guy for me. Some free crowd control. No problems with that. Then he's going to come here, grab this guy, give me enough time to chop this guy in half. And lastly, when I kick this guy backward, he'll kind of launch him on his own, do some juggling, all without me pressing a button, give me plenty of time to do that. And that's when we had all that in and working. When we had all that in and working, that's when Atreus officially became a part of the family. Playtesters were giving him positive feedback, and Corey didn't have to remind everyone that he would never get cut, because he never would. We'd all get fired instead. So that's because gameplay-wise, he was talking to all our systems. Everything from the vision to what we needed to retain from the older games and to what we wanted to reinvent in the new game. In fact, Atreus himself is probably the culmination of everything we were changing about this game. So, some final thoughts on this. Determine your vision as early as possible, because if it's strong, you should be able to use it as a guiding point throughout. I'm a fan of those thematic phrases I've been mentioning, like Ballet of Fire and Plow the Road and Monster in a Box, because it's something very simple to explain and then refer back to if you're heading in the wrong direction. Like, I mention all of this as if we were like brilliantly making all these decisions every step of the way, but we weren't. There was a lot of hindsight is 20/20 here. Also, deconstruct your inspiration and break down the player's choices. Since we were making a sequel, that partially meant us looking back on our own games, but honestly, we deconstructed many, many games along the course of development to determine what type of feel we were looking for. And lastly, determine your gameplay loop, because specifically those player choices and what you intend to add. Hopefully these choices go well with your vision in order to make a cohesive feeling game, and also hopefully bring something new to the table that's unique to your own game compared to others. So for us, that started with that vision of close and personal, deliberate, mythical power. But while we did that, we wanted to retain the one versus many, that playful combat, and that power for all. And lastly, we wanted to reinvent the game as well, starting with that close camera, new emphasis on target prioritization, multiple damage types that the player could choose between at any time, and that great teammate in Atreus. And it was all those things combined that allowed us to take an axe to God of War gameplay. So before I end this talk, I do want to mention a few other talks that go deeper on some of the concepts I mentioned here. If you want to know more about that great teammate, our senior designer, Hayato, is giving a talk later today called Raising Atreus for Battle in God of War. This talk will go in depth on how Atreus became a great teammate and much more. And if you're interested in knowing more about how we solved problems regarding that close third-person camera, please check out the talk from Mihir, our now lead combat designer. He has a talk called Evolving Combat in God of War for a New Perspective that goes deep on the choices we made to actually land that close camera feel. Thank you so much. So we still have a little bit of time for Q&A if anybody's interested in that, and then after that I will go to a wrap-up room somewhere. You'll be able to find me. Hi.
Hey, what's up? Awesome talk, awesome game. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
My question for you is, it was a super huge surprise, midway through this game where it's like, I fall in love with the axe, I've bought in, like, I'm into it. It's like, by the way, here's your blades back. I'm curious how that decision was made in terms of, like, was that always, like, in the vision book that, like, Kratos would sort of discover this ancient power? And after making all these, like, deliberate decisions about the axe, how was it, what was it like making the blades fit into this new combat system?
Right, yeah, so the blades were not in that vision book. At first, it was all about the axe. It was all about this new feel for the game. Eventually, in a few revisions, we knew that the blades were coming back in story mode. We hid that from everyone, but we knew. And I think the next question was, how do we convert the blades to kind of fit this vision? So a lot of that came from just the third-person camera alone, because the things that we were learning about the axe in terms of holding enemies in place and keeping enemies burning or freezing or whatever, they applied to all the things for the blades as well. So when we worked on the axe, we actually probably delayed work on the blades probably too long for comfort for some people. But what we were doing is kind of finalizing what the axe was going to be, and then it was easy to apply that to the blades afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
There. Thanks for the talk. Is there anything in hindsight that you think didn't work well or that you would do differently next time?
Oh yeah, I mean all that stuff I talked about, I would have did that a lot sooner. Yeah. Like I think whenever you're doing something new, there's always a lot of doubt in terms of what you're doing. There's a lot of second guessing, and sometimes that can distract you from actually moving forward. So we actually did do a good job of getting out of that haze quicker than it seemed like we would at the time, but I think it could have been even quicker. We could have gotten to some of these decisions even faster if we kind of bought into the vision earlier.
And as far as like the final product goes, do you feel like there were decisions that you made that you like if you'd gotten there sooner, you could have developed, I don't know, this system more or something like that?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, there hasn't been a God of War game that I've made that there wasn't something that we could have added at the end. Thankfully, we keep making them, so maybe we'll make another one.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, great talk.
Hi.
So can you talk a little bit about some balance challenges you faced in terms of forming combo moves, especially when you started adding more elements like fire and ice into the game?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question was like, how do we balance like all the damage types? So every single damage type had a way to be scaled on difficulty and per enemy and everything like that. So we would decide on an enemy basis like which ones could stun faster than others, how would we bring that down? Does Atreus stun? Is that too easy? We'll bring that down. Or maybe the axe stun is too easy. Bring that down. Sorry, I punch stuff a lot when I'm talking. We essentially just had tuning parameters for all those separately. And then as we were tuning the game, we would go into each individual circumstance and change that as needed.
Cool, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Someone from over there.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't even see it. I'm sorry, yeah.
Was the third-person camera the only reason that drove you to move the attacks to the shoulder buttons? And follow-up question is, how long did it take you to give players the option to go back to the face buttons?
Oh, so the question was like, did we have the shoulder buttons as an initial thought? And yes, it was. Like the moment we knew that there was a third-person camera, immediately those shoulder buttons were the things we wanted to use. It actually took us a long time to add an option for the face buttons as well, and that was kind of mainly that as through development, we started adding more things to kind of satiate everybody that might want to play this game and might want to play it a certain way. So we added the face buttons mainly for that, but the true way to play is probably the shoulder buttons for us.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, over here.
Thank you. One of the things I've noticed is that you mentioned like players, for example, forgot to use Atreus button to shoot, something like that. And I was wondering, there's this issue in many action games where players will use like a third of all the cool abilities you have in the game. And I was wondering, how do you deal with this issue? Because, I mean, how do you deal with the possibility that there's this player or there's maybe a lot of players that will only use like the most basic attack, dodge, basic attack, dodge. How do you deal with this issue that kind of turns the game into a little repetitive thing?
Yeah, so the question was that when you have all these abilities and players start forgetting about them, like what methods can we use to make them remember?
Well, not only make them remember, but give them a reason to use something else.
Sure.
But the most basic attack.
Right, yeah. So what you're talking about is probably the most difficult part of gameplay tuning.
Yeah.
Because as even in our game, like there was some people that on certain difficulties probably just didn't touch certain stuff. You'd have to determine what is important for them to know and what you can live with them not knowing. So for example, in our game, like easy and normal difficulty, we kind of didn't care if you didn't do certain things. So if you just played the game and ignored part of it, still were having fun, that was fine for us. But the harder difficulties were tuned to kind of raise the value of those concepts. So a lot of what we try to do is we would look at analytics of what people are doing and how they're playing the game. And if we see them, like a good example is actually the runic attacks, where people would equip one runic attack and have that equip the entire game when we first put all runic attacks in. And part of that was just because the value of the other ones just weren't apparent. Like people couldn't tell the difference between one versus the other, so they just stuck with one. So we would keep tuning that and making it more pleasing feel-wise, more pleasing value-wise, until we start actually seeing more people start to use it. And unfortunately, you kind of have to take that as a case-by-case basis. You could just forcefully remind them and say, hey, press this button. Or you could have lock and keys where it's like, hey, this enemy forces you to do this if you weren't doing it before. But we try as much as we can to try to make sure the value of all these are unique and different enough that there's some scenario where you can make use out of it.
Yeah, because usually when you force it, a lot of players will just not really like that.
Yeah, because it just feels like work then. So you kind of want, to encourage them to do it, encourage them to want to do that by the value in the specific thing that this move is adding.
So you also you said that you defined as a team, okay, this the players can live without knowing, but this they have to know.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like there's some, when you look at our combat system, there's so many things in it. We can't expect 100% of people to know everything, but there's certain things that we know we want them to do, such as grabbing enemies. That was important to us. We really wanted players to do that, so we highlighted the R3 over the life bar, and we did all these things to make you want to do it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So I know you touched a little bit on how the player would manage enemies, a little bit regarding adjusting the camera slightly. But there was 2 talks, I believe, last year, one regarding Doom and one regarding Hellblade, where in Doom, enemies would have a ticketing system where only a certain number of enemies could attack at a time. And for Hellblade, all the enemies would try and go from the periphery or behind to the player's front, so they could manage all the enemies that way. I was wondering if you guys had a similar system for either of those, or if an enemy could attack, they were just going to.
So yes, we did have it. So the question was like when enemies circle around Kratos, was there some kind of system controlling all of this? And yes, there absolutely was. Like ever since the first God of War, we've had like a fight circle system where enemies would similarly have some kind of token. It's not exactly the same, but something like that, where they would have this aggression meter and there's a certain amount of enemies that can kind of fill that meter, and when it gets to full, characters can't attack. And actually, you're kind of getting into the details, I think, in Mahir's talk. So you'll get a little bit more information on that. But essentially, yes, we did, because that's the only way you're going to be able to do this. Like if you have enemies all swarming you and no way to control it, it just is unplayable. So we've always had that.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question is about Atreus. So how did you balance him to not take away intentionality from the player? Say, for example, I'm waiting for an enemy to attack me and I really want to parry him. But then before that happens, Atreus stuns him. Like,
oh, right, yeah. So the question is, like, how do we prevent Atreus from, like, just screwing you over half the time? Yeah. So this was actually a big part of Atreus' design and a lot of the iteration, because a lot of the things that Atreus does is designed to not take him away from your position. So a good example is like when he comes up and he grabs a guy. When he does that, all he's doing is making it easier to hit the guy that's already right in front of me. He's not pushing him aside or doing anything that's going to stop my view. Similarly, if I'm pointing my reticle at an enemy, that'll be the worst time for Atreus to knock him out the way. So we have a lot of checks to make sure that what Atreus does actually only enhances what I'm probably already doing. So another good example is if I knock the guy away and he lands over here, it's fine for Atreus to come here and just kind of beat him down. But if he moves him, then that's going to probably screw me up if I was going to evade and follow him. So we try to make sure that everything Atreus does is just an enhancement on what I'm doing, so he never gets in the way.
Thanks.
Hi, you mentioned at a certain point switching to multiple different resources in combat, and I'm wondering if you ever got to a place where you were worried that you had too many, or where players would be confused by all the different element options, and if not, how did you avoid that?
Yeah. So the question was, like, once we started adding all the damage types and various things in the game, what happened when did it become too complicated, or were we afraid of that? And the answer to that, I think, is the entire studio is constantly afraid of that, especially if you're not a combat designer. Like everybody else is just, always scared about everything you're going to add, especially if they're playing the game themselves and they're not doing those things. So that's where playtests help a lot, because we had about 20 people each time coming in playing the game, and then you would hopefully see within those 20 people a variety of things that they're doing. Because again, you don't expect just in one play session for everybody to gravitate towards everything, but everybody has their own play styles, and you try to put things in the game that kind of contribute to that play style. So we would look at that and try to see if players would start to gravitate towards it. And if we started to see things to be a bit too complicated, meaning that we'd ask them and see if they understand this and they already have no idea, we either try to simplify it or make it so they can understand. But similar to my answer to the other question, it's like we were okay if you didn't know some things.
Thank you.
Hey, Jason, thanks so much for your talk. It's cool to see some of the magic behind the scenes.
Thanks.
My question is regarding how this combat system interfaced with bosses. Were there any special considerations or adaptations you had to make?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the bosses, especially the big bosses like the dragon, like they always have their own kind of system in terms of how they're going to attack you, because they're kind of outside the combat system. Thankfully, other characters like the Stranger, no spoilers, but the Stranger, it's like he was an enemy that was in our combat system, so we always have special considerations for any special case things that need to happen, but generally characters like that operate within the combat system.
Thank you.
Hi.
Great talk. Thank you very much.
you.
I've been playing God of War since God of War 1 back in, I don't know, when I was young, I guess.
Sweet.
And I've always been able to beat them on the hardest difficulties. One of my favorite parts of games like this, especially in God of War 3. Jumping into this game, obviously from the get-go, you can't play the game on the hardest difficulty because it's like, you're clearly not ready. But like, I jumped into the difficulty above normal, and it demolished me. So I don't know if I'm just like Kratos, really old and angry, or if it's something that, a big thing I noticed about the difficulty was that it sort of just extended enemy life bars to make them take a lot more hits, as opposed to other games that have just made it to where the time to kill is the same, but the damage outputs are higher, so there's a lot more risk and reward. Was there a lot of talk in the studio of doing that deliberately for the purpose of a lot of the juggling mechanics you were talking about?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of gameplay tuning. I mean, I can say that we didn't really extend a character's life bars just to make more juggling happen, but usually what we're trying to do is we're trying to emphasize some of the more deliberate decision making. So some ideas like, oh, I can launch a guy and throw the axe and pin him into a wall for an instant kill. It doesn't matter how much health they have. Things like that were things that we were trying to promote on some of the harder difficulties, so we would tune their health up slightly, but hopefully not too slightly that it felt like you couldn't win, but more so that we wanted you to kind of take part in some of those deliberate decisions that I was talking about. So like in that example where you could freeze a guy and kick an enemy into multiple guys, that gives you a lot of time to kind of make these decisions, but if you don't do that, it probably will be a rough experience. Yep. Oh, I think we're out of time. So thank you. I'll head to the...